and professors. In all his work, is committed to making links between the research and actions, and he has worked with the communities to support their language revitalization efforts, helped establish, expand organization for language activists, engage in advocacy to influence government policies, raise awareness of linguistic injustice through social and traditional media. So before going into our formal session, so I want to keep a few house rules that firstly, the professor will start his session, followed by a question and answer. So the session will be around like 30 to 40 minutes and followed by a question and answer. For the question and answer, I request everybody to raise your hand, which is there at the bottom of our what it called Google Meet, so that we can go one by one. So yeah, so before going into the that formal session, I want also to what we call introduce our senior researcher, Tizit Abdullah, to share a few words about our foundation and also on the our FNVA Talk series histories and all. So Tizit Abdullah, please.
So Teshi Delay and greetings to all. It's a privilege to have you all with us today here, gathered online as Tibetans around the world today hold prayers for Tibetan Martyr Lobga Rangzen, who committed the ultimate form of sacrifice for Tibet by committing self-immolation in front of the UN headquarters. And in Delhi, likewise, today only, we had a similar protest and a prayer service here at Jantar Mantar. And today, at this particular FNVA Talks, it's an honor and privilege for us in having Dr. Gerald Roche, who will be speaking on the topic of intensifying language oppression in Tibet from invasion to ethnic unity, which is one of the main demands that Lobga Rangzen raised before he passed away. I personally had the privilege of taking part of an online session where Dr. Gerald Roche was releasing his book, hosted by Lathrop University. And also, like when I got the opportunity to host a podcast with Tenzin Orzila, who's the VTAG Australia coordinator, she spoke highly of Dr. Gerald Roche, especially how he eloquently spoke the Tibetan language. So basically, FNVA Talks is a talk series hosted and presented by the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, where we have experts, leaders, and policymakers on Tibet speaking on different topics and sharing their valuable insights on the subject of Tibet and the larger Himalaya. We have had the privilege in having 4 such talks already. All of them had taken place in person, and this is the first of many such FNVA talks which we shall be having online. We personally hope that all of you would be part of it. And maybe I can just add this, like our talk series would also be, especially the online part, we shall be recording it so that a larger number of audience can view it much later. So thank you.
So I would like to invite Professor Gerald Roche to kindly present his presentations and give his insights to about the language and all.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope that you can hear me okay. If something's not coming through, just let me know. But thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very aware of the gravity of the events that that happened 49 days ago, and it takes seriously the responsibility to talk about these issues on that day. It's the 160th self-immolation over almost 2 decades now, and it's a really stark reminder of the ongoing and intensifying tragedy of colonial occupation in Tibet, which is what I'll be talking about this evening. So I will just share my talk slides with you. Okay, and hopefully everyone can see that. Once again, if anything is going wrong, just call out or send me a message. Otherwise, I will get started with the talk. I have my contact information there, so if there's something that you want to ask or something you don't think of until later on, please feel free to reach out afterwards. I'll also put my email address up at the end of the talk. And I really welcome any opportunity to continue the conversation that we start today. So I want to start out by acknowledging where I am and the political realities of the place where I live. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Federation, who are the traditional custodians and Indigenous people of what is today the city of Melbourne in the country of Australia. This flag, which I'm showing you now, is the Aboriginal flag. And here in Victoria, in Melbourne, we are in the process of negotiating treaties with Indigenous people to recognize that their land was stolen illegally, that there was a violent war of occupation, and that the traditional owners of this land have never been adequately compensated, and these historical truths have not been adequately recognized. And this includes also an element of language. So the Woiwurrung language of the Wurundjeri people was oppressed and was not spoken for many generations due to the violence of European colonization here. And the Wurundjeri people are in the process now of bringing that language back, and it's an enormous effort for them to do that. And so I also just want to acknowledge that struggle and pay my respects to the people involved with that work. So just to give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about, in total, I'll try not to go over 40 minutes. I have a lot that I could say, but I'll try to keep it relatively concise, and hopefully that will give us more time for conversation. But what I want to start out with is just talking about the research that lies behind some of the things that I'm going to say. I think it's really important for everyone to have an understanding of where this information comes from, how it was produced, so that you're able to evaluate it and assess it yourself. So after talking about the research background, I'm then going to give a bit of a conceptual overview of this concept, language oppression, that is in the title of my talk and in the title of my book. So I'm just going to explain what I mean when I say language oppression. Then I'll have a bit more time to talk about the specifics of language oppression in Tibet based on my research. And then I will try to bring things up to the present day with just a very quick look at the new so-called ethnic unity law and what it has to say about language and how this fits into the bigger picture that I'm going to describe to you. So broadly speaking, that's what I'll be talking about. And yeah, as I'm going along, if you have questions about particular elements like the research methods or different claims that I'm making, I would encourage you to make note of those as you go, and we can go back and talk about any of the points that I raise. I'm really happy to clarify anything that I'm talking about here. Okay, so just to give you some background on how I know the things that I am going to talk to you about. So the general background of this is that I moved to Amdo, what is now Qinghai province, was living in the city of Zilong from the year 2005 until 2013. I went there as a volunteer for an Australian organization called Australian Volunteers International. And I was teaching English and teaching anthropology there. And I helped found an organization. I was working at a university where all of my students were Tibetan. And when I arrived there, they approached me to help set up an organization to record oral traditions, songs, stories, and so on. So we worked together to do that. And it was through that work that I first started working on issues related to language and started to get a sense of some of the political drivers of the cultural and linguistic changes that are happening in Tibet today. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about specifically, most of this comes out of my book, The Politics of Language Oppression in Tibet. And the research of that book was specifically carried out between 2013 to 2018. During those 5 years, I was living in Sweden, and then I was living in Australia, and I was returning to visit for a short time every year, a few weeks at a time. But I had the longer experience to draw on when I had studied Amdo Tibetan, learned to read Tibetan, and got to know people and situations locally. So that fieldwork was a case study focusing on a specific linguistic community in Amdo. They speak a language they call Manigacha. It is not Tibetan. They are Tibetan. So I was looking specifically at that community and putting them in the broader context of Tibetan language politics. I did surveys with around 200 households in 4 villages where the language is spoken. And I also did another set of surveys with linguistic experts from around the world who know about different languages across Tibet. I carried out a series of interviews, mostly through interpreters, in Amdo Tibetan and in Manigacha. In total, there were 143 interviews. And I also carried out a lot of document analysis. So this was looking at a range of documents, everything from online essays by Tibetan authors to pop songs to Chinese policy documents in Tibetan, Chinese government newspaper propaganda, and so on. And I tried to weave all this together to build up a complex picture of language politics in Tibet. And in terms of how I think about and study these things, the background, my academic background is also important. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm primarily a political and linguistic anthropologist. So I was not like studying the language. I was studying the political and social life of the language. And I'll explain more about what I mean by that as I go through. That should become clear, hopefully. But I also draw broadly on like a range of different research fields that look at language from different perspectives. But again, not really looking at the language itself in terms of grammar and vocabulary and syntax, but looking at the social and political life of language. So the left-hand side, this is another book that I've worked on, the Routledge Handbook of Language Revitalization, to give a sense of the kind of work that I do. So what is language oppression? So this is not my term. I didn't invent it. I took it from some other scholars. There will be a reference list at the end where you can learn more. But language oppression refers to enforced or coerced language loss. So it's when a group of people no longer have their language anymore because they were forced to give it up by someone else, essentially. And the way that we know that language oppression, or the way that we measure language loss, the way that we know that a group of people is losing their language, is that we look at what's called intergenerational transmission of the language. So we look at, is the language being passed on from parents to their children? And that's the key measure. When a language is no longer being passed from parents to children, that language no longer has a future. And that language will be lost very soon. So if you have a large group of people, when 100% of them are transmitting the language to their children, that language is safe, its future is secure. As the number of families transmitting the language declines, the language becomes more and more at risk. And when no families are transmitting the language, that language is lost. We call it then dormant or moribund. So some people think that a language is in danger when the language is changing, like new words are appearing, young people aren't using grammar correctly, and so on. Or they think that language is in danger when there are words coming into the language from another language, from a dominant language. Those are separate issues. They're not really directly related to the loss of a language in the same way that uh, intergenerational transmission is. So basically, when when we think about language oppression, when we research language oppression, we're looking at essentially this question of how do you force someone to stop speaking their own language to their child, right? And that's a political problem. So if people are completely free to transmit whatever language they want to their children, there would be no language oppression. But when people feel pressured and coerced and forced into using a dominant language to their children, with their children, that's language oppression. That's a political problem. And that's what I'm researching when I talk about language oppression in Tibet. So it's important to note that language oppression is a global problem today. It's happening all around the world. And when I'm thinking about language oppression in Tibet, I'm trying to think about it in comparison to what's happening in other countries and in relationship to what's happening in other countries, to understand how is the Tibetan situation similar to and different from what has happened in other places historically and what is happening in other places today. So there are about 7,000 languages in the world. About half of those will no longer be spoken at the end of this century, and that is primarily because of language oppression. So it is a widespread problem. It is happening in most of the countries of the world. So there are 192, 193 member states in the United Nations. Of those 193 countries, 162 of them are found in something called the Endangered Languages Catalog, which keeps a record of all the languages in the world that have declining intergenerational transmission to some degree or another. So that means that approximately 2/3 or above 2/3 of the countries in the world are sites of language oppression today. Language oppression is most intense in countries like Australia, where Europeans invaded and then massacred and displaced indigenous people. So there were hundreds of languages spoken across Australia. There are about a dozen which are still spoken by all generations. So there has been massive enforced language loss in Australia. However, the center of gravity of global language loss is now shifting to countries like China, India, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And hopefully what I'm going to tell you will explain some of why that is happening. So let's get to talking about Tibet then. Hopefully I've laid enough groundwork about language oppression to help you understand what I'll be talking about now. So the really important thing to acknowledge in talking about language oppression in Tibet is that pre-invasion, like prior to the Chinese Communist Party invading and taking control of Tibet, Tibet was linguistically diverse. There were as many as 60 different languages spoken across Tibet, not including any form of spoken Tibetan language. So amongst those 60 languages, about 30 of them were spoken by other ethnic groups and 30 of them were spoken by Tibetan people. And the way that the Chinese state has carried out language oppression, what I will show is that they have systematically targeted those smaller non-Tibetan languages first and foremost. So those languages, in some sense, offer a vision of the future of Tibetan. under the new policies in particular. So this map on the left is one that I created with a linguist from Japan, Hiroyuki Suzuki, drawing on the linguistics literature in English, Chinese, Japanese, and perhaps also French, I think. And this just shows the eastern edge of Tibet, so northeastern Amdo, eastern Kham, and it shows only the non-Tibetan languages that are spoken throughout that area. We weren't able to do a map for all of Tibet to show the distribution of all the languages. We didn't have enough information at the time, but this gives a sense of the extent of linguistic diversity. We have these small communities living in fairly small areas that speak a completely distinct language. And if anyone wants to know what I mean when I say a language, we can come back to that later. So the other thing to know about the pre-invasion situation beyond this situation of diversity is that most of the communities across Tibet, when it came to making decisions about their language, like what language they would use in what situation, most communities were self-governing. They were making decisions autonomously. There was no government telling them what to do, no government telling them they had to send their child to school, no one telling them they had to read newspapers or listen to the radio in any specific language. The communities were linguistically autonomous. And so mostly what happened in those communities was that they spoke their own language in the village amongst each other, but there was some presence of written Tibetan language, usually in connection to the local monastery. And then Tibetan was sung all across Tibet, even in communities where people didn't speak Tibetan. So the Tibetan language was a kind of unifying cultural tradition, both in terms of the script and the monastic tradition, and in songs that people sung. And the basic problem that I'm going to be describing is what happened after invasion when that autonomy was taken away from communities. When communities no longer had self-determination, they no longer had the autonomy to make decisions for themselves about their language. All the problems I'm going to describe come from that loss of autonomy. All the problems I'm going to describe come from that lack of self-determination. So what happened? Just very briefly, in the book I describe it slightly differently, but to simplify things, I'll divide it up into two periods. From the 1950s to the 1970s, roughly, the Chinese state was relatively weak. It tried very aggressively and violently to impact social and political structures. It tried to ban languages, destroy texts, destroy monasteries, and things like that. But it really lacked the capacity, it lacked the power to really transform people's identities, transform their communities, transform their understanding of themselves. But it did acquire that ability, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there were these like very violent, destructive periods that didn't have a deep linguistic impact on these communities. The communities continued speaking their languages. But what was happening at the same time was that the state was working on a social and linguistic engineering project that was the basis of all of the language oppression that they engaged in afterwards. So the state engaged in this project to classify everyone living within China into 56 Minzu, which in some ways the best translation for that is races. So they classified everyone into 56 different groups. And then they essentially identified a single language for each of those 56 groups, meaning that there were 56 languages recognized across China. And this is in a country with 300 or more languages. And so what that did was it created a situation where 56 languages were formally, officially recognized. The 250 odd other languages, the state just decided that they didn't exist, that they were dialects, they're not real languages. And we'll see that that's very consequential. So from the 1980s onwards, China's state capacity started to increase. China became more powerful as a country, and that's simply because of foreign investment. So from the 1980s onwards, China was integrated into the global economy. American, Australian, European factories all shifted there. All of that money that flowed in through those factories and the foreign investment that empowered the Chinese state. And the Chinese state crucially did two things with that. They built infrastructure, roads, rail, electricity, internet, to really physically connect places like Tibet to China in ways that they never had been before. And the second thing that they did was that they engaged in institution building. So healthcare systems, education systems, media systems, and so on. And it was really through this infrastructure and through these institutions that the Chinese state was able to really begin profoundly transforming Tibetan people's everyday lives in a way that fundamentally affected people's capacity to freely choose which language they wanted to transmit. And I'll say a bit more of that in the next slide. But basically, we have these two periods from the 1950s, establishing this system of classifying people and languages, and from the 1980s onwards, through the increasing power of the Chinese state, implementing that linguistic system. So those 250 unrecognized languages started to experience very heavy language oppression. So what happened is that across those two historical periods, so like from invasion until today, we've seen a very consistent campaign. There have been changes in minor elements of it, but it's gone consistently in a single direction, which is that we have seen immediate and intense oppression of minority languages in Tibet. So minority languages here, I'm referring to those languages in Tibet that are spoken by Tibetan people, but are not Tibetan language. So those languages were targeted deliberately, systematically, and continuously by the Chinese government for language oppression. Those people were forced, coerced into giving up their language. And that's worked. I'll go on to that in a minute. Tibetan has been oppressed, not to the same extent, but it has been oppressed. The main argument, or one of the main arguments I'd like you to take away from this, is that the government has kind of waited until it was successful at oppressing those minority languages. Now that the intergenerational transmission of those languages is completely collapsing, the Chinese government has escalated its program to target Tibetan language, which was much larger, much harder group to target. So it's had this program of attacking the smaller linguistic communities first, and now that they've had success with that, they are moving on to target more intensely and in different ways the Tibetan language. One example of what this looks like in practice comes from this publication, academic publication from last year by two Chinese academics, Han Chinese academics, and they did field work in Kham, around the area of Kangding, where there is a language there. They call it Muya. It's called Munyak locally. So Munyak was spoken by Tibetan people there. that language is no longer spoken by children. Instead, everyone either speaks Tibetan or Chinese. So these smaller languages like Munyak, like Manikacha, which I studied, these are not being learned by most children today. Tibetan is still learned, Chinese is still learned, but Tibetan is heading in the way of those other languages. So how does the state do this? How is the government oppressing these languages? So the first way is through erasure. They just pretend that these languages don't exist. They generate knowledge that says that those languages are dialects, they're not equal to other languages, denies their equality, denies their existence, pretends that they're not real. This is denialism on a massive scale, and the state gets away with it. When the government can say that this language doesn't exist, they don't need to provide any resources or support for the language. So no money for schools, education, teacher training, printing books, no money for media, no money for translation or interpretation, no money to translate healthcare information, medical supports, no money to translate government documents, produce media, just nothing. So what that means is that without any material support, without any financial support, these languages end up excluded from all major social institutions. So if you speak Manikacha, if you speak Manyak, you go to the doctor, you cannot speak your language with your healthcare professionals. You cannot go to school and learn in your language. You cannot switch on TV and hear your language. These languages are completely excluded from all significant social institutions. On top of that, there are also what I would describe as violence and terror. So when I was doing research in the Manikacha speaking community, I did a series of interviews about discrimination against Manikacha speakers. And there was basically whenever Manikacha speakers were around other people in the local environment, they were insulted, humiliated, joked about, teased, sometimes leading to physical violence and so on. They were targeted systematically for their linguistic difference constantly. And the state doesn't need to direct anyone to do this. It just needs to not intervene. So the Chinese state is extremely punitive in the way that it punishes things that it doesn't want to happen, and it doesn't punish this at all. And then in terms of terror, as you know, Chinese state suppresses violently and aggressively and with extreme intensity any form of protest movement. So Tibetan language activists are arrested and tortured, and this is the way of preventing change from happening. So the outcome of this is that intergenerational transmission of these minority languages has completely collapsed. All of them are endangered, which means that they're on the way out. They're no longer being spoken. That how endangered they are, how quickly they will cease to be spoken, differs between the different communities. But all of them, except perhaps one, have a rapidly declining intergenerational transmission. So we can see that in this graph here. This is an estimate of the percentage of families in the community that still speak the language. So if you have 50% or below of the families in the community speaking a language, that's past the tipping point, and the language is pretty much gone from then. Okay, so just to take things up to the new Chinese ethnic unity law, I'm just going to talk about Article 15, which focuses on language and has 5 clauses in it. So I'll just summarize each of the 5 clauses briefly. So it starts off by talking about the full promotion of Putonghua, so Putonghua being the national language, Mandarin Chinese. And it says that the full promotion of Putonghua must not be obstructed. So this tells us that anything which is viewed as an obstruction to the national language will be oppressed, dismantled, and so on. And so basically, this gives the state a license to choose if something is obstructing the full promotion of Mandarin, and anything that is seen as obstructing the full promotion of Putonghua, it now has a legal basis to systematically attack that, to enable Putonghua to be promoted. The second clause talks about Mandarin or Putonghua as becoming the basic language of education, and that includes preschool. So from a very young age, all children will mandatorily have to learn in Chinese, and this in Mandarin Chinese. This was already the case in many places across Tibet. It was typically the case for most communities that spoke those minority languages, because they were completely excluded from the education system. Now, from the other clauses, we'll see that this doesn't necessarily mean that Tibetan will be excluded from schools, but that's not necessarily good news either. Third clause says that all state organs must use Putonghua, meaning that minority languages can never be used on their own. So there is no context in which a minority, that another language can be used without being accompanied by Mandarin. So what that means is like no mother tongue education that only uses Tibetan, no publications that only have Tibetan. It's not clear what this means for media and social media and so on, but it mandates co-presence of Mandarin and other languages at all times. And then when those two languages are present together, when Putonghua is being used with another language, the other language must always be lower subordinated to Putonghua. So Putonghua must be highlighted in terms of position and order and so forth. So it always has to be given the more important position. So these are the first four clauses in Article 15 of the new ethnic unity law. They all talk about Putonghua. They all talk about Mandarin. They're only talking about other languages to say how they must be below, subordinate to Mandarin. And so then the last clause is the only one that really focuses on other languages. It says the state respects and protects the learning and use of minority languages, but in terms of how it does that, it's only going to digitize books and digitize minority languages and do research on old books. So it's just restricting languages like Tibetan to a state of preservation in a museum, not as living languages that are being supported to be used. And basically this creates a mechanism of expanding intensified language oppression for Tibetan, where Tibetan now increasingly faces a fate like languages like Manikacha, like they have for decades now, which is almost total exclusion from all important social institutions, which is an engine of language oppression. I will finish there. These are some of the references that I was drawing on. That QR code will take you to a short article that I've written. There's my email address for any questions. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for your patience and your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful presentations and all, and for the information for our participants. If if any of our participants want to buy the professor's book, it is available on the Amazon.com, the language of operations in Tibet. So before going into the Q&A sessions, I also want to share a few insights that Professor have also highlighted how the minor languages, especially the Manichacha and all, are getting extinction. And especially not just the Manichacha, we also like, I'm also from the a region where the Pemakopa language, they don't have a script, but they do have the linguistic. So that is also getting extinction. And also among the Pemakopa, there is also one minor language within that language that is called Glimba language. And I hardly believe there is only now 5 to 6 households left in this entire world who speaks this language. And that is available in Odisha state of India, where they are settled as a refugee settlement. So I think this is I don't know, but that seems to be quite a research gap, especially to study the Pemakopa language. And for our participants and all, if any of and if anyone is interested to carry forward research, then please contact Professor Roche on the guidelines and methodology and all. So yeah, thank you, Professor Gerald Roche from the foundation. We really appreciate your work, and we really thankful for your insights. And we shall continue to connect in the future if there is any more such events. So for our participants, so the next our webinar is on the what you call Nimalamula, because she have written a book on no tongues in their mouth on the assassination of Tugutizhi Rinpoche. He is from the Lithang, which comes under the contemporary Sichuan province of China. So that is on 25th of September. So we shall update you accordingly. If you are interested, you can join on that webinar. So I think sort of have written something over here. Sure. So Sora, I request you to please connect with the Professor Roche through mail and all. And
Yeah.
and Professor is also on the X if someone want to connect, and Professor book is on the Amazon if someone want to read and to go through. So yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and please do get in touch if you have more questions or would like to discuss further. Thank you again.
So please, all the participants, touch with Professor if you have any other question. Thank you. Thank you.